welcome to Law Power Hour. Good morning, Bernard A.R.
Good morning, Barry. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Thank you for coming today.
Well, thank you for having me.
I'm glad you dressed casual because you're going to talk about a difficult subject. And I don't want our listeners to be scared away because this man has a very, very strong background in tax law.
I do.
And I understand that you have a master's degree in tax law.
I do, from the University of San Diego.
Now, let's pick up this microphone a little bit.
Yep.
You know, the reason I invited Bernard on today is and it was quite a surprise. I happen to know his father, and I didn't know it until we got here. I know his uncle, I know his family, but he and I have never met. And I'm excited that he's here because we had a big battle in Washington over changing tax laws, and none of us have any idea how the new tax laws are going to apply and how they're going to affect us. Now, I know you can't get into each one of the regulations because that's not what you do for a living. You provide people with advice on their tax problems as a lawyer, and that's going to be part of our program, correct?
That is correct. I specialize in helping people who are behind on their taxes.
Okay, how do people get a hold of you if they're behind on their taxes?
Well, you can call me at the office anytime. It's 248-262-3400. It's AR Law. That's AYAR. And you can also go to the website. It's ayarlaw.com.
You know, I've got a lot of clients who are embarrassed over the fact that they haven't paid taxes in 5 or 6 years. They've worked, but they haven't paid taxes. How do they get away with it?
Well, I mean, sometimes it takes a while for things to catch up with you, but it's nothing really to be embarrassed about. You'd actually be surprised at how many people are actually fall behind with their obligations to the IRS. And it's always worse in their head than when we actually go through it. It's never as bad as people make it feel, and they build it up in their mind, because fact is there's a lot of options and a lot of ways to deal with, past due taxes, and most of the solutions revolve around your budget and what you can afford. So it's nobody's ever supposed to be out in the street because they're behind on their taxes.
Well, there's a difference between not filing taxes and not declaring income, isn't there?
There's a big difference, yes.
Okay, well, let's talk about that for a minute because I think our listeners really need to understand the concept. First of all, if you don't file your tax return, is it a crime?
It can be, but usually not. If you clearly can pay and you make a lot of money and you're not having taxes withheld, they can charge you with a felony for failing to file your tax returns. Okay, but most people, the vast majority of people who fall behind, don't need to worry about that, or have virtually no risk of being accused of any criminal wrongdoing in that respect.
But not to declare income is a crime.
To knowingly leave income off your tax return is very much a crime. It's tax evasion. It's a very serious crime that I've had clients actually go to prison for. So.
Now, in that area, the government, as I understand it, looks at you, and I'm not referring to you personally,
Right.
but looks at the individual and says, well, wait a second. Nice house, nice car, no tax returns. Then they start doing some background, find out the car's paid for, the house is paid for, no tax returns. So the light bulb goes on.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody is not declaring their income. Is that how it generally occurs?
That's generally, and most often, it's because they got a 1099. It's a lot more simple than that. The 1099s were issued and somebody didn't report them, and that's how they catch you for not filing your returns. As far as when they come after you for not reporting your income, absolutely, they look at your spend, because like the mortgage banks tell them how much you pay a month in mortgage interest, and your savings banks tell them how much interest you're receiving. So just from the documents that come in from third parties, they can usually have a pretty good idea how you're living without doing, an in-depth investigation. And then that's what tips them off. And then somebody will look at it, and if something's there, they call it a source and application of funds. They'll start looking at all the money you spend and add it up and say, this is all income. You must have been making this much.
So let me ask you a question. We take Barry Keller, the lawyer. And I get 1099s
Uh-huh.
because I have a tax ID number,
Right.
and I do services for other lawyers, and they pay me, and I get 1099s from them as well.
Right.
They can go online and see if all those 1099s are filed. If I lose a few of them, my CPA can pick up that information for me, can't he?
You can. I mean, you can always get your transcripts from the IRS. They become available usually in June of the following year. They're called the wage and income transcripts. And matter of fact, the transcripts is when somebody's delinquent and they haven't kept up with their obligations, the most important thing you need to do, or I do, is take a good long hard look at the transcripts and order everything, and you see everything that's come in over the years, not only the wage and income like the 1099s and stuff, but also also what's known as the account transcripts, which show what has transpired, as far as filing and non-filing and balance dues and whatnot. But yeah.
I don't want to take it to the highest technical level, but I want to break it down in the simplest form.
Yeah.
I'm working for you every week and performing services. Do you have an obligation to file a 1099?
Yes.
You're paying me?
Yes. If your services are related to a business of mine. If it's something personal in nature, so if you come and maybe do my landscaping at my house, then not necessarily, but if you do work for me at my place of business, then absolutely I have an obligation to file a 1099.
It's like my process server. He's in and out every week, and I pay him by check. I've got to give him a total at the end of the year with the 1099, correct?
Correct, and that's due by the end of January.
And if I don't do that,
You can get a penalty. It can go anywhere from $50 up to 30% of whatever you paid your process server. They call that the backup withholding penalty.
so it's my obligation to do that.
Yes.
Okay, so that's just one example. But if I pay my process server in cash all the time, and there's no record of it, and I don't charge it off as an expense in my business, I violated the law, haven't I?
Absolutely. I mean, you have an obligation to account for everything. And there's nothing wrong with dealing in cash as long as you still fill out the 1099. And you have to charge it off on your business and take the deduction. And the problem is, the problem's not the cash. The problem is that it's all unreported. As long as, you do the 1099, then there's nothing wrong with it. But as soon as you don't, then you've broken the law and could, get some real stiff penalties as a result.
Now, I'll give you the flip side of it, and here's where it really comes in. Someone will walk in my office.
Mhm.
They're over 55. They worked for 20 years for cash.
Mm-hmm.
They've never reported. They've never paid in any money,
Mm-hmm.
so they don't have a Social Security
That's a big problem.
account.
Mm-hmm.
They can't draw Social Security disability.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the flip side of it if you're not paying your taxes.
I'll tell you what I would advise that person to do is go back for 6 years and file all their returns to claim all the income. And the secret is you'll get credit for your Social Security tax whether you actually pay it or not. You just have to report it on your taxes. So if they file as self-employed for the last 6 years, and then they would have a very large balance to the IRS, but then they can go for what's called an offer and compromise program. With an offer and compromise, you can often settle for pennies on the dollar. I've had situations where that exact thing has happened, where we get them caught up with the returns and they owe, $1 bazillion, and at the end we settle for $500 or something real small. Now that's not every case, and every case is different based on the facts, but that's what you do in that situation.
Okay, let's just talk about the offer and compromise because it applies to a lot of different situations.
Yeah.
That came into effect in 2016?
In the state of Michigan, it's been in effect with the IRS for a lot longer than that.
Okay, so now it's applicable, it applies both at the state and federal level in Michigan for offer and compromise.
Correct.
And on a state level, it's real important to know that if you have a tax obligation, you can lose your right to drive a vehicle in the state.
They could. They can not renew your license. At the federal level, actually, what a lot of people don't know is you can lose your right to travel outside the country. They can take your passport away. It's a new law that passed last year. It's one of the recent changes in the tax enforcement is anybody who's seriously delinquent with the IRS the State Department will be notified and they'll deny or revoke your passport.
Okay, so the offer and compromise is a very important part of the law.
Yes.
Okay, so if we have an offer and compromise situation, going forward, are you under the offer and compromise program until you've completely paid off all of the debt?
Let me just back up a little bit because maybe some of our listeners don't know what an offer and compromise is. The offer and compromise program is where you owe the IRS a lot of money and you settle for something less than what you owe. Usually it's because you don't have, the money to pay them. And then after you come to an agreement with them, you have to pay off the settlement amount. Now, the settlement amount is usually based on your collectability, so sometimes we can settle for very little money on very large debts. And then until you get the offer amount paid off, then the debt still exists. But once you finish paying the settlement amount, then they'll release all the liens. But the other thing a lot of people don't know is there's a probation period. The reason the IRS is, walking away from these big giant debts is because after they've settled with you for the next 5 years, if you fall behind again, then the whole deal gets unwound. So what they're doing is they're taking somebody who in the past maybe wasn't paying their taxes and turning them into somebody who does pay their taxes in the future. And that's really why the offer and compromise is a really important tool for the government to collect its taxes.
But if you come into the IRS and let's say you had a windfall, just as an example, somebody owes $100,000.
Yeah.
That's a lot of money for anybody
That's
just
a
to
lot.
write a check and pay the IRS.
Right.
But they win the lottery.
Yeah.
And they go in, they pay off the whole debt.
Yeah.
They don't have to worry about offer and compromise, do they?
Correct.
They don't have to worry about 5 years forward being on probation, do they?
No.
They just have to get lucky.
Yes.
I'm not advocating going out and buying lottery tickets to solve your tax problems, but I'm just trying to indicate to people if they came into some money and they were able to pay off all of their debt, they wouldn't need the offer and compromise, would they?
That's absolutely right.
But for the ordinary person like me, the offer and compromise would be a great opportunity to resolve a problem.
Yeah. Matter of fact, one time I had a guy who owed $100,000, and I settled for $100 flat. And it's for the right person, if you have the right situation and you qualify, it can be a phenomenal tool to really put your problems behind you and move on,
Well, one of the problems that develops, and I think our older listeners should listen to this because it's really important.
Mhm.
Older listeners who are on Social Security retirement and have jobs,
Mhm.
and they earn an amount greater than their Social Security on their job,
Mhm.
can be penalized.
Absolutely. The way Social Security tax works is the Social Security check may or may not be taxable. And what makes it taxable is if you earn other money. So the more non-Social Security money you earn, the more tax you have to pay on your Social Security check. So not only are you paying income tax on the money you earn at your job, but it also costs you some of your Social Security money.
So it becomes a big issue in terms of the responsibility, if you're earning more on your job than your Social Security, to pay quarterly on your taxes to make sure that you stay ahead of it.
Yes. Or you can just have it withheld from your Social Security check with doing a W-4, and you send it to the government and you ask them to take it right out of your check so that you stay ahead or pay quarterly.
Okay, we're going to take a break for a minute and then we'll be back and we're going to talk about the new tax laws.
Are you in legal trouble? Are you in need of legal advice? Or just have general legal questions? Call 1-800-529-8721. That's 1-800-LAW-USA1. And watch Law Power Hour and get your questions answered by experienced attorneys who are experts in their field. That's Law Power Hour, hosted by Barry Keller, attorney at law. Saturdays at 10 a.m. here on WHPR Detroit Live.
Back in the middle of 2017, there were these huge debates going on in Washington over the new tax legislation.
There were.
And it was almost impossible to figure out who won. Would you agree with me?
I would. I would very much agree with that
I'm not
statement.
making a joke out of it. I'm really serious about the guy with the orange hair wanted us to do so much that it was almost impossible for us to get things through. I mean, he's a driving force all over the world. I guess now he's going to North Korea to negotiate an anti-nuclear thing, and he's going to bring Dennis Rodman along with him to make sure it works. But without Dennis Rodman, I don't think it's going to work.
Right.
But having said that, we've got a really messed up set of new tax rules. And I know you're a tax lawyer and you're a specialist, but I tried to read through these and it was very difficult. Now, I want some insight from you.
Perfect.
Are these new tax laws going to help us?
It depends on who us is. I think there's a lot of people that are going to benefit and they're going to see deductions. I mean, self-employed people who accept lawyers and doctors and accountants, go figure, right? But most self-employed people are going to see a really significant deduction where they get 20% off of their taxes, essentially. They get to write off 20% of their income right off the top. And then they only have to pay tax on the remaining 80%. So anybody you have to be under $300,000 a year. So, the working Joe who's drywall installer or a carpenter or, these independent contractors, I think they're going to make out big in this deal.
What happens if you have a subchapter S corporation where your money flows through the corporation? You got the corporation to protect you from being sued individually,
Yeah.
and the income flows through to you. Do you still get that 20% deduction?
Yeah, as long as you qualify under the income ceiling, which starts to get phased out once you earn more than $300,000 a year, and as long as you're not in professional services, so specifically doctors, CPAs, and lawyers don't get to go to the party, but everybody else does.
And why was it that our Congress people didn't want doctors, lawyers, and accountants to benefit under this act?
I don't know. Actually, I figured that the lawyers would, be the most congressmen are lawyers, so you figure that they'd make out if anybody else, but who knows?
So if I'm running my dry cleaning business,
Uh-huh.
and that's my only source of income,
Uh-huh.
and I'm self-employed, and I run it, I can take the benefit based upon what my income is, correct?
Yeah.
And you define income as what's left over after paying all your expenses.
Correct.
Okay.
And even if you're over 315,000 net, you can still get the benefit of the deduction, but it's tested against how many people you employ and how much wages you pay. So if you make a lot of money, but you also provide a lot of jobs for the community and pay a lot of wages, you can still get the deduction.
Okay, now let's take the best example of all that would apply here. 2 household incomes.
Mhm.
Husband works for one of the big three. Wife is a nurse working in one of the big hospitals.
Mhm.
So you know their combined income is about $140,000 a year at least.
Okay.
You with me?
Yeah.
They have 4 children. What kind of deductions do they get under the new laws?
Okay, so under the new laws, as husband and wife, if they file joint, the standard deduction, which used to be 12,500, almost doubled to 24,000. Okay, so they got an additional $12,000 deduction right off the bat. But what was eliminated in this new law was the personal exemption, which is about $4,000 for each person. So what did we say, 4 kids?
Yes.
So there's 6 people in the house. They're losing out on $24,000 in personal exemptions, okay? And they're picking up about $12,000 in standard deduction. So they're behind, a couple $1,000. But then to counter that, they get more money for what's called the child tax credit. Okay, so that scenario you laid out, I think they make out about even under the new law, if I had to guesstimate.
Okay, but under the new laws, as I understand it, the tax percentages and the tax brackets have been lowered, correct?
They have a little bit.
Okay, you said a little bit.
A little bit.
See,
For
explain
individuals.
that.
Okay, so they have had, the top bracket went from 39.6 down to 37. So 2.6%. The other brackets went down, around in the same ballpark. Okay, so the actual tax rate for individuals didn't change by that much. It's all the other stuff that's in there, the additional standard deduction. In Michigan, people who really lose out are people who maybe used to itemize and lost some of their itemized deductions. Specifically, really people in other states lost out on this deal because they limited the amount of taxes you can write off, property tax and income tax. So people in high tax states lost a really valuable deduction for some of them. In Michigan, I think we made out fairly well under this new law.
Okay, there was a time, like if you bought a house, at least up until 2018, you could write off the property taxes you paid.
Yes.
Can you do that anymore?
Now it's limited up to around $10,000, and you can either write off the property taxes or your income taxes, and so you can still write it off, but it's limited to a ceiling of about $10,000.
One of the things you and I talked about before the show was the fact that you could write off mortgage interest when you were buying a house.
Yes.
Has that changed?
Kind of. There's a ceiling on the mortgage interest. There always has been, but it came down. I think it's up to $500,000 as far as the loan amount. But what changed it is because the standard deduction, the standard deduction is a deduction that everybody gets. So you can take the standard, or you can do what's called itemized deduction. And itemized deduction is where you deduct things like your property taxes and your mortgage interest, but to take those, you have to give up the standard deduction. So even though mortgage interest is still deductible, okay, a lot less people are actually going to be able to take advantage of the deduction because now the standard deduction is bigger. So you would have to pay a lot of mortgage interest or have a lot of other deductions. Otherwise, the married couple is just going to opt to take the $24,000 standard deduction because, you'd have to pay a whole lot of interest to get over that.
Okay, now if somebody's behind on their taxes or hasn't paid their taxes that we talked about for several years, wouldn't you agree with me that because of the changes in the tax law, this is a perfect time to get caught up on your back taxes?
Absolutely.
Because the changes in the law, it's going to be too confusing in 2019 and 2020 with these changes for you to go between the two tax codes and try and work out all these problems.
Yeah. I think the software that does the taxes resolves a lot of that, but it's always, what makes it a perfect time to get caught up, to be honest with you, is that it's early in the year. Because most stuff you do with the IRS, excuse me, I'm sorry, if you want like a payment plan or if you want to do an offer and compromise and settle with them, they usually require that you have to be what's called current with your taxes. And what that means is for the current year, you have to be up to date. So being that we're in March and not September, it's much easier to get caught up with your 2018 taxes now. So that way you can be current and you can qualify for an offer in compromise or an installment agreement or some kind of solution that fits in your budget.
Well, suppose that you get an extension on your taxes. You could get into the offer and compromise later in the year as long as you paid this year's taxes, couldn't you?
As long as you're up to date and you have all your estimated tax payments in for this year. So you have to pay, the quarterlies if you're self-employed. Most people who fall behind because they're not having enough taxes withheld at their job. So, or they're self-employed and they get a 1099. So you have to pay your quarterlies, which are due 4 times a year. So if you're doing an offer and compromise in November, say, well, you have to make sure that your first 3 quarterly payments for 2018 are caught up. And sometimes that's a lot of money to come up with. Whereas if you want to do one now, well, the first quarterly payment isn't due until next month. So it's a lot easier to say that you're, up to date. So now is really a perfect time. You can always do them and you can always submit them. But generally, if, a client comes to me in October, I'm going to try and hold it back until January because that's the optimal time really to deal with your taxes is at the beginning of the year. But, now is always better than later though, that's for sure.
Okay, we're going to take a break for a minute, come back and talk about a very sensitive issue. Divorce and alimony and the impact under the new tax law.
Uh-oh.
We'll be right back.
Are you in legal trouble? Are you in need of legal advice? Or just have general legal questions? Call 1-800-529-8721. That's 1-800-LAW-USA1. And watch Law Power Hour and get your questions answered by experienced attorneys who are experts in their field. That's Law Power Hour, hosted by Barry Keller, attorney at law. Saturdays at 10 a.m. here on WHPR Detroit Live.
We're back with Mr. Ahar. Would you tell people how to get a hold of you? He's really an attorney, but I'm so jealous because of the way he's dressed today. He looks fantastic.
Yeah, I like to keep it casual where I can, so it's important to be comfortable for me when I'm working. It makes it easier. But yeah, you can always get a hold of me if you can call the office. Again, the number is 248-262-3400. The firm is AR Law, that's AYAR Law, and my website is arlaw.com. You can always find me. I'm not that difficult to look up.
He's an honors student in law school, honors student in graduate school with a specialty in tax law. He solves problems for people who have tax problems with the government. It's that simple. Now, here's one of our newest problems. Just occurred on January 1st. One of my friends is getting divorced. And he said, well, it doesn't matter. I can get divorced in January 2018 as opposed to December of 2017. What's the problem?
Okay, so in the new tax law, they changed it the way alimony is treated. Okay, it used to be that if you got divorced, and you had just one spouse had to pay the other spouse alimony, the paying spouse, the payor spouse, got to deduct that. So, they take a deduction on their tax return, and the person who was getting the alimony had to pay tax on the alimony they got. It wasn't the case with child support, it was just alimony. The person who paid it got to write it off, and the person who received it had to pay tax. Under the new tax law, for divorces that occur starting on January 1, 2018, that changed. So now the person who's paying the alimony does not get to write it off, and the person who's receiving it doesn't have to pay tax on it. So what's going to happen is it's going to be, people are not going to want to pay as much alimony as they used to, and it's going to make divorces, I think, more contentious and more difficult to settle because there's less money, because the tax deduction was very valuable to people who were paying, significant amounts of alimony to their ex-spouse.
Now, if you were divorced before January 1st, 2018, you are still entitled to the deduction.
Yes. That was very important that they did that, because they would have unraveled a lot of deals that, took place in the past.
But if you get divorced after January 1st, 2018, and your spouse, either way, stays at home and you go to work and you need to support that spouse, you're not going to get a deduction for doing it. That's what it comes down to.
Right. So you're not going to get a deduction. So now, being divorced versus take the same couple and leave them married, well, now the taxes are drastically lower when you file, jointly, and one spouse works and the other one doesn't. But then when that same couple divorces, now the person who's making all the money has to file single, okay? So their taxes go up dramatically. So now it made it a lot more expensive for couples to get divorced, so to speak.
Well, here, you're making me conjure up ideas in my head while I'm sitting here, and I've got this great idea. I'm not getting divorced. I'm not going to worry about it. Here's the situation. Couple's going to get divorced. And he doesn't want to pay alimony because he's not going to get a deduction for the alimony.
Right.
So he gives his estranged spouse, he being the husband, here, you keep the house, I'll make the payments, and I'll still get the deduction. Will I still get the deduction for the taxes and the interest on the house?
No, not if he doesn't live in it, or not if he doesn't have an ownership interest in it. So,
Okay, listen up. This is important for you to understand. So he has to retain his ownership interest in it to get the deduction.
yes, it has to be your house to deduct the interest. A lot of people don't know that.
But doesn't mean I have to stay there for it to be my house, does it?
Correct. So you have to, two things have to be true to get the mortgage deduction is you have to be liable on the mortgage and you have to own the house. So you have to meet both those conditions. So if you are not on the mortgage or you're not on the deed, then you can't take the deduction.
But if I'm on the mortgage and on the deed and I don't live there, I can take the deduction.
Yes.
And that may be a way of dealing with part of the alimony problem.
But if they say, if that's just disguised alimony, they can come back and challenge that transaction. And they have a doctrine called substance over form, where if you do all this intricate, fancy planning to get around one law or another, the IRS can just come in and rewrite your deal if they really wanted to.
Well, that's part of a property settlement, though. You could do that, couldn't you?
Right.
Good morning.
Well, good morning to both of you. I appreciate the information that you share each week. I have two questions. One, if a person has a say the emergency savings of $5,000 or $6,000. Now I know you have to claim the interest on it, but if this money just stays in the savings account year after year after year, you don't claim that as income, right?
Correct. You just have to pay tax on the additional interest that you earns. Yeah.
The other question is about a person becoming what they call legally separated. How does that apply when you file taxes?
If you're legally separated, then generally that means you're not divorced. So you have to file either married filing joint or married filing separate. However, sometimes you can file as head of household if you don't live together and you have You know, you're taking care of the household, and somebody else actually lives there. So it's legally separated for tax purposes. You're generally still married, so you wouldn't be able to file a single. Most of the times, if you're legally separated, unless you qualified for head of household.
Oh, okay.
Mhm.
But usually people who are legally separated would want to file separately, right? Is that
It depends on the situation because a lot of times it's not a good idea to file separately. You end up losing out on credits and deductions that you would otherwise got. So
Oh,
sometimes couples who are separated still choose to file jointly. I have many clients who do that because
Oh.
it's better for everybody that way, you know. But of course, every situation is different, and you
I
really have
see.
to talk to your. That's really a question for you have to have a good tax preparer who can run all the numbers and tell you all that. My specialty is mostly dealing with people who are behind, so I don't, you know.
I see.
Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you so much.
Well, thank you for calling.
Bye now.
Okay, so now getting back to substance and form, because here I am, the artful lawyer over here, trying to figure out a way to solve a problem. We're going to get around it by paying the mortgage on the house.
Yeah.
If it's in the property settlement and it's approved by the court, and it doesn't say it's in lieu of alimony,
Mm-hmm.
it's just a property settlement,
Mm-hmm.
it's going to pass the scrutiny of the IRS, isn't it?
Most of the times, yes. Not necessarily. The IRS isn't bound by the court orders. They can rewrite the settlements, even if the judge approved them. If things are done purely for tax reasons, then that's when the substance of reform comes in. I've seen it happen in several cases where, you know, especially if you have parties who are amicable, you know, they're going to write the contract, whatever's in the government's worst interest. And the government has tools to invalidate that, but it's rare that something like that would happen.
Now, here's where the red flag would come up on your tax return.
Mhm.
As soon as you file it, the computer lights go flashing, everything goes on, and you get a letter from the IRS.
Yep.
You own 2 homes.
Okay.
You're divorced.
Yep.
But your name's on both of the homes.
Yeah.
The IRS is not going to allow you to have deductions on both of those homes, are they?
I honestly don't know the answer to that question. I would have to check and get back
But
to you.
that would raise a red flag, wouldn't it?
It might. I know right now, under the old tax laws, you can deduct a second home's interest if it's, but now they have limits on how much, you know, mortgage you can have, you know, and have it still be deductible. And to be honest with you, I don't know if they did away with the second home deduction or not.
Now, do you think it's important for people who are coming in to money?
Mhm.
And this is really an important question. They know that they're going to get an inheritance.
Okay.
Do you think it's important for them to meet with a tax lawyer to get tax planning from a tax lawyer? Now, I want you, audience, to listen to my question very carefully. Meet with a tax lawyer as opposed to a financial planner or a CPA, because there's always tax consequences when you receive money, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a good idea to meet with either a tax lawyer, but to be honest with you, a good CPA can provide, you know, sometimes invaluable planning. It depends on the situation. But if you are going to come into some money, you really need to get some tax advice from somebody who really knows the tax code. I'm not going to say that CPAs won't do it. Financial planners are generally not trained specifically in tax, but a good CPA or a tax lawyer would be a really good thing to do and get some planning, because I've had clients who had some really big problems that could have been avoided if they got the right planning advice, you know, up front. But, you know, that's where I come in, is when people don't get the planning, and then down the road they end up needing my help. So,
Well, that's my point. If our listeners called you
yes.
and they were coming into money, let's say that John over here was going to receive money from Aunt Nellie when she died, and it was her IRA.
Yes.
And there was $250,000 in the IRA.
Yes.
He'd need somebody to tell him what to do with that money, wouldn't he?
He would, absolutely. He would need somebody who can tell him what the taxes would be and what kind of implications and how to minimize the taxes. And if somebody like that were to call my office, I have a really good CPA who does all the planning. I personally don't do anything that's forward-looking, but I work very closely with a really good CPA who knows the ins and outs of the tax code and would be able to advise that client, and he'd be able to plug in different things into his tax program and figure out different scenarios and how much tax they would owe. My specialty is more backward looking, is when people come to me after, you know.
We're going to take a call for a minute. Good morning. Good morning.
Hello?
Hello? I think we lost our caller this morning. Okay, so give us your number, tell us who's working with you in the office so we can get that resolved.
Okay, so my number is 248-262-3400, you know, and the name of the guy in my office, the CPA I work with, his name is Javon. He's got his own firm. He's actually a family member of mine, his AR accounting, and, you know, that's where all the planning advice comes from.
Good morning.
Uh-oh, we lost another one.
Well, somewhere along the line, I apologize to those people who are calling in. There's a problem in the telephone line. It's not coming through. Now, do you work with Javon on these issues?
I do.
So they can call either you or
They can
Javon.
call me, and I will make the introduction, and they can go from there. I provide more general advice, but really a strong CPA is invaluable in a situation like that.
Now, in terms of tax fraud issues, we haven't talked about that yet.
Uh-oh.
I see a big smile coming on your face there.
That's right up my wheelhouse. I deal with lots
Okay,
of
well, here we
tax
go.
fraud
We're
issues.
in his wheelhouse. Okay, you're the captain of the ship now,
Okay.
and I want you to talk a little bit about tax fraud. Exactly what are we talking about in tax fraud?
Well, anytime a lot of people don't report their taxes honestly, and it's kind of a byproduct of the system we have. You know, you're responsible for doing your own taxes, and I have some clients who have, you know, maybe not paid what they should have over the years, and get selected for an audit. There's all kinds of ways that the IRS can run your return, all kinds of red flags that people, you know, don't know about that cause you to get selected for an audit if you've underreported your income or overstated your deductions. I mean, those things come up all the time, and it's really important because when you talk about tax fraud, for them to use the F word, as I call it, there's a really high standard. You know, they need what's called clear and convincing evidence. So if you've done something wrong on your taxes and you're selected for an audit, it's very important that you go to somebody who can protect you so that, you know, I've had some clients who, you know, were off by hundreds of thousands of dollars on their taxes for no good reason and were never accused of fraud because I was able to protect them and stop, you know, evidence and make sure that the IRS's investigation, that they only got what they're absolutely entitled to. And if they can't build a case and they don't have that clear and convincing evidence, it's not fraud, or at least civil fraud. For it to be criminal fraud and for you to actually go to jail, it has to be what's called beyond a reasonable doubt. You know, they have to really have strong evidence against you that you knew what you were doing was incorrect. And usually what that comes from is having the wrong guy defend you or not having somebody defend you during the audit stage in the very beginning. Because usually when they build a fraud case, it's always because the taxpayer or the taxpayer's representative either said the wrong thing, put their foot in their mouth, or lied to the agent, or turned over documents that they weren't required to turn over, or somebody did something wrong that built a fraud case. So the number one tool, if, you know, first you should report your taxes honestly, but if you haven't and you get that letter saying you've been selected for audit, your first move is the most important, because what you say and do can really bury you. And what a lot of people don't know about this issue is that your CPA doesn't have privilege. the government can force your accountant to testify against you. So a lot of people, when they get that letter, the first thing they do is go to the CPA. Well, that could end up,
Let's stop right there for a second. It's really important. There's an attorney-client privilege.
Right.
And that attorney-client privilege only exists when you retain an attorney to represent you.
Correct.
So if you have a CPA representing you and the CPA goes with you to the IRS, there's no protection.
There's limited protection.
Okay.
So there's an accountant-client privilege, but that does not apply in criminal cases. So if you're accused of fraud, then they can force your accountant to testify against you.
You know, most of the big crime bosses in this country, dating way back to Al Capone, never got convicted of crimes. They got convicted of tax fraud.
That is how they get you. I've had clients who were suspected of criminal wrongdoing who ended up getting in trouble for taxes. You know, I can't go into too much specifics, but, you know, that's the common denominator. Everybody's got to pay their taxes. And if they see you as, you know, a bad guy and they can't get anything else, then they're going to go for taxes. That's what did Al Capone, like you said.
So what you said is really important. If you have a tax problem, you have to go down to the IRS. You're further ahead by going with a tax lawyer than a CPA.
Yeah, and you're even further ahead if you don't go at all and the lawyer just goes for you. Because usually in my cases, that's the other thing. I go down to the IRS all the time, and it's always the same site. In the waiting room, there's an accountant sitting there with their client waiting for their turn. Well, I never bring my clients with me unless I absolutely have to, because the clients generally don't know when to keep their mouth shut. If you know, and
Well, you're being truthful. I mean, we're not criticizing the clients,
Right.
but you're being truthful, because I wouldn't know what to say at the IRS myself, and I've been practicing law for 50 years.
Right.
So you didn't say the wrong thing. You said the right thing. Okay, but let's explain to them how you handle this process.
well, if you
Go ahead, explain to them.
if you have a problem with the IRS, if you're, you know, owe them money, or if you're under audit and there's an agent, the agents have a right to demand that you appear before them. So, you know, I can't always promise my clients that they won't have to go down to the IRS. However, usually, because I have a good working relationship with the agents, I usually call and ask ahead of time if I can just come and answer all their questions and tell them that, you know, if there's more information I can't provide, we can schedule another meeting with the client. And I usually do everything I can to avoid having that meeting. And in most cases, the agents go along with what I ask, and they're perfectly happy to just deal with me and not have to drag a taxpayer downtown to go to the IRS. Nobody wants to take a day off of work to go deal with that. So in most of my cases, I can avoid my clients ever having to show up. But you have to know to ask, and it's important that you have a rapport and you have a relationship with the auditors. I've worked with most of the people in town. That's the other difference between a tax lawyer like myself and a tax accountant like a CPA, is a CPA's job is mostly to fill out tax returns. And sometimes when a problem comes up, they deal with the problem and they go to the IRS. My job is only to deal with problems. I don't even do tax returns. You know, I refer them out to accountants. My only thing that I do day in, day out is deal with problems and negotiate with the IRS. And in doing so, I've developed like a relationship. Now, not anything improper, you know, but it's common courtesy. There's a working relationship. Most agents at the IRS know me by first name, and they know the other attorneys who work in my office, because we're down there all the time. And sometimes that can mean the difference between getting dragged down to the IRS for the audit and being able to just let somebody else deal with it for you.
Okay, let me cover it this way, because it's really important to understand.
Yeah.
If I want you to represent me at the IRS, I still have to sign a power of attorney, though.
Yes.
Yeah, you've got to explain that to our audience. They have to understand that you have to have an authorization in writing.
Right. It's a form you fill out.
I mean, in this country, I can't contact a company that's trying to collect a debt unless I have something in writing indicating that I'm representing the people.
Right.
I might do that when there's a large credit card within a state trying to compromise it,
Mhm.
but I still have to have it in writing. So if it's in writing and they authorize you to go down to the IRS, that is your calling card to go in, your invitation to represent them at the IRS, isn't it?
Right, right. So that's the first step in any case is they come in and we go over the situation and we fill out a power of attorney form. It's form 2848, and you fill it out, sign it, and then from then on, I can speak on their behalf. And most of my clients never have to have even one conversation with the IRS agent.
Now I have to ask you the scariest question of all.
Okay.
The question I never ask any attorney
Yeah.
that comes on my show. But we're talking about a very sensitive issue, and that's why I saved it for the end. What are your fees for doing this kind of work?
It varies case by case. So sometimes I work on an hourly fee basis. Most of my cases are flat fee where it's negotiated up front and there's certainty to the cost. Sometimes it's contingent based on results where, that's appropriate. What I do offer every client is everybody's welcome to all the free advice in the world. Anybody can call me anytime and I'll bring them in, go over their situation, give them some advice, and at that first meeting is where we can discuss the fees.
That's what I wanted to hear.
Right.
So you'd give them, what, half an hour consultation to come in and talk to you?
Usually they're an hour. Sometimes they go longer. Sometimes people call back and get a second consultation. I'm very generous. I really like what I do. And when you like what you do, you like to talk about it. You like to talk to people. So people call me all the time and just ask questions, and I'm happy to help. So, I don't have a stopwatch or anything and shuffle them out of the office. So generally I book them for 30 or 60 minutes. But a lot of times they go long. Sometimes there's a follow-up phone conference. I'm very generous with advice. I just want to see people get the help that they need.
How do we reach you?
Again, 248-262-3400. Or you can find me on the website. It's arlaw.com, AYAR law.com.
And he's got a short infomercial on YouTube. I watched it. It's good. Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much for having me. It was such a pleasure.
Okay. Have a good week. Next Saturday, I'm not going to wear green, but it's going to be St. Patrick's Day.
Awesome.
I'll see you then.